The terminal buzzed with travelers weaving through lines, dragging wheeled suitcases, balancing coffee cups, and scrolling through phones. Gate 12A of the JFK International Airport gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, where the final call for Flight 309 to London was about to be made. Passengers trickled into the priority lane, presenting their passports with barely a glance exchanged. Amidst the bustle stood Abina, tall, composed, and dressed in a cream pantsuit with matching heels and a subtle gold brooch. Her poise was unshakable, her posture confident, her eyes focused. She was in her early 40s, but moved with a grace that silenced doubt. She carried nothing but a small designer handbag and a hard-shell carry-on, both neatly tucked beside her seat near the first-class lane. Abina had already been checked in, her digital boarding pass scanned, and her seat confirmed. 1A. She had earned that seat through decades of dedication, countless sleepless nights, and unrelenting pursuit of justice. But to those who saw only skin color and status symbols, her presence stirred quiet discomfort. Sitting a few rows back, Martin Carter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket and narrowed his eyes at Abina. A seasoned hedge fund executive in his late 50s, Carter believed he had mastered the art of measuring people at a glance, and to him, the sight of a black woman seated confidently in first class without fanfare triggered immediate suspicion. He leaned toward the nearest flight attendant with a forced smile. "Excuse me," he said in a hushed voice. "That woman, up there, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but are you sure she belongs in first class? She's been watching everyone a little too closely. Just seems off." The attendant, taken aback, responded professionally, assuring him all passengers were verified. Still unsatisfied, Carter walked over to a uniformed TSA officer standing nearby and whispered a similar concern. Within minutes, 2 airport police officers approached the gate. Officer Bradley, a senior officer with years of service but a mind dulled by bias, led the approach. His younger partner, Officer Miles, followed close behind, his body language cocky, his eyes scanning Abina like a threat assessment. They stopped in front of her without introduction, standing just close enough to assert dominance. "Ma'am," Bradley said sharply, "we need a word with you. Please step away from the boarding line." Abina glanced up, startled but calm. She slowly stood and looked from one officer to the other. Around them, passengers turned their heads. Some whispered. Others began recording. "May I ask why?" Abina inquired, her tone even and clear. Miles stepped in. "You've been reported as acting suspicious. We need to verify your identity and your ticket." Standard protocol. Abina reached into her handbag with slow, deliberate motion and pulled out her passport and boarding pass. She handed them over without hesitation. Bradley took them and examined the name, photo, and seat assignment. His eyes squinted at the details, then flicked back to her. "This your ticket?" he asked, a hint of sarcasm curling the edges of his voice. "Yes," she answered. "Kind of an expensive seat," he muttered. "What do you do for a living?" "That's not relevant," Abina replied, her voice cool but firm. "I am a legal passenger, and unless there's a valid security reason, you have no cause to detain or question me." Miles smirked. "You've got a lot of attitude for someone being questioned." Bradley crossed his arms. "You're refusing to cooperate?" "I'm refusing to be harassed without cause," Abina answered, meeting his stare without blinking. Bradley turned to Miles. "We're removing her. She can explain herself downtown." Before she could react, Miles grabbed her by the arm and twisted it behind her back. Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd. A child cried. A woman dropped her phone in disbelief. Abena didn't resist, but she raised her voice. "This is unlawful. You're making a grave mistake." Her words were drowned out by the metallic click of handcuffs. Her handbag fell to the floor, forgotten. She stood tall despite the humiliation, her wrists bound, her head high. Phones flashed, videos rolled, whispers became angry murmurs among the travelers. Carter stood nearby, watching with quiet satisfaction. Abena was led through the terminal, flanked by the two officers like a criminal. Her heels echoed on the tile floor, the only sound in an ethiu, otherwise breathless corridor. Every step they took deepened the injustice, but her face showed no fear, only calculation. She memorized badge numbers, noted every camera, logged every voice she heard. She knew the law better than any of them, and they had just walked into a storm they couldn't see coming. As they entered the airport security station, the officers still believed they were in control. They couldn't have imagined that the EB woman they had just handcuffed in public was no ordinary traveler. They were about to learn exactly who Abena was. The cold fluorescent lights inside the airport holding room did little to soften the tension in the air. The space was small and impersonal, with dull gray walls, a bolted metal desk, and two uncomfortable plastic chairs. Abena sat upright in one of them, her wrists still cuffed behind her back, her expression composed but alert. Across the table, Officer Bradley filled out a form with deliberate strokes, while Officer Miles leaned against the wall, arms crossed and smirking. "So, Miss—" Bradley paused, glancing at the ID again. "Abena. What exactly do you do for a living?" Abena didn't flinch. "You'll find out soon enough." Her voice was calm, firm. It wasn't the voice of someone intimidated. That irritated Miles. He stepped forward, pointing a finger toward her face. "You think you're smart, huh? Sitting up in first class, acting all high and mighty? Let me tell you something. Talking back only makes you look guiltier." "Haven't talked back," she replied. "I've simply exercised my right to speak." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "Oh, we've got a rights expert here," he chuckled, but his amusement faded when Abena continued to stare at him without a hint of fear. Her silence was louder than any argument. It unnerved him. Outside the holding room, another officer entered the station, a man in his early 50s with silvering hair and tired eyes. This was Sergeant Coleman, a senior staff member in charge of evening airport operations. He looked through the small glass window in the door, saw the woman inside, and felt a twinge of unease. Something about her composure didn't sit right with him. He knocked once and entered. "What's going on here?" Bradley looked up. "Suspicious behavior, Sergeant. Passenger was making others uncomfortable. Claimed her first-class ticket was hers, but we have reason to believe it's not." "Did you confirm the ticket?" Coleman asked. "We're getting to that," Miles said dismissively. "Let me see her documents." Bradley hesitated, then handed over the passport and boarding pass. Coleman looked at the passport photo, then glanced at the woman in the chair. His eyebrows lifted. "Abena. Last name, Adeyemi?" He sounded the name out carefully. Abena's eyes met his. She gave a single nod. "What is your occupation, ma'am?" Coleman asked. Bradley scoffed. "We already asked her. She's being difficult." Coleman ignored him. "I am an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court," Abena said, clearly. For a second, the room went silent. The words hung in the air like a grenade that hadn't gone off yet. Coleman blinked twice, trying to process what he had just heard. "You're a Supreme Court Justice?" he asked again, his voice low. Abena nodded once more. "Appointed less than a year ago. I'm on my way to London for a judicial summit. You've just unlawfully detained me, humiliated me in public, and violated several federal laws." Bradley looked confused. "Wait, like the actual Supreme Court?" Coleman turned to him slowly. "There's only one." Miles laughed awkwardly. "No way. She's just saying that." "I suggest you verify it before you dig this hole any deeper," Abina said coolly. Coleman stepped out of the room without another word and picked up the phone. His hands trembled as he dialed. Within minutes, a call was confirmed with Washington, and the shock rippled through the department like a jolt of electricity. The woman they had dragged out of first class was not only a federal judge, but one of the highest-ranking legal figures in the country. Coleman's face turned pale. Back inside the room, Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miles had gone from smug to visibly unsettled. Neither spoke, unsure whether to apologize or disappear. When Coleman re-entered, he couldn't look Abena in the eye. "Justice Adeyemi," he said, his voice stiff with dread. "I sincerely apologize. This is an enormous mistake. Please, let me have those cuffs removed immediately." He fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the restraints. As the cuffs clattered to the desk, Abina rubbed her wrists. Red marks were already forming on her skin. "This will be reported," she said plainly. "I will not allow this incident to be buried or brushed aside." "Of course," Coleman nodded rapidly. "I understand." She stood, gathering her belongings with deliberate grace. Coleman stood to the side, trying to mask the panic rising in his chest. Outside, more officers began arriving, alerted by the internal report. The airport's head of security rushed in next, his face tense. "What's happening?" he asked. "You'll want to read this," Coleman said, handing over a printed memo, with her name and title. As the security chief scanned the paper, his mouth fell open slightly. His eyes jumped to the window where Abena now stood, her back straight, her eyes full of quiet fire. In the corner, Bradley wiped sweat from his brow. Miles, no longer confident, stared at the floor. The consequences of their actions were beginning to settle in. The cameras, the witnesses, the phones, everything had been recorded. They hadn't just arrested a judge. They had humiliated a symbol of justice. Abina turned to the security chief. "I want the head of airport operations, the U.S. Marshals Service, and the federal liaison contacted immediately. And I want full documentation of this incident preserved, including all body cam footage, security video, and audio records." The chief nodded, already dialing his phone. She glanced once at Bradley and Miles, not with anger, but with something colder, disappointment. They had underestimated her. They had looked at her and seen only what their prejudice allowed. Now, their careers and reputations teetered on the edge of collapse. Justice Abena Adeyemi would not be silenced. Word of what had happened spread through the airport faster than announcements over the loudspeaker. What began as a quiet humiliation was now a full-blown federal incident. The holding room, once silent and cold, had become a point of chaos. Phones rang nonstop. Radios buzzed with updates. Senior staff paced with growing anxiety. By the time the deputy airport director arrived, a cluster of law enforcement officials had formed outside the security office, each of them tense and silent. Justice. Abena Adeyemi stood quietly by the window, arms crossed. Though she said nothing, her presence commanded the space. She had no need to raise her voice. Every officer, clerk, and supervisor who entered felt the same thing, an uncomfortable awareness that they were standing in the presence of someone they should have protected, not arrested. 2 black SUVs pulled up near the private entrance. Out stepped agents from the United States Marshals Service, flanked by 2 representatives from the Federal Judicial Center. Their arrival changed the energy instantly. These weren't local officers scrambling to control damage. These were professionals, dispatched to address what had now become a matter of national concern. One of the marshals, a tall woman named Deputy Marshal Graves, entered the holding area, her expression tight with focus. She walked directly to Abena and extended her hand. "Justice Adeyemi, we've been briefed. Are you injured in any way?" Abena shook her hand and nodded slightly. "Not physically, but the damage is done." Graves turned to the security chief. "We're taking over. Everything from this point falls under federal jurisdiction. I want every second of body camera footage uploaded and sealed. Interviews begin immediately. No one is to leave the premises without authorization." Bradley and Miles, standing just outside the hallway, heard every word. They didn't move. They couldn't. Whatever illusion of control they had clung to earlier was now gone. Their badges still hung from their belts, but the weight of them had shifted, from pride to guilt. A media relations officer entered the scene next, whispering to the director that reporters were gathering outside. News outlets had caught wind of the story. Someone had already leaked phone footage online. A video of Abena being handcuffed, surrounded by officers, was already trending. Comments poured in by the second. Hashtags formed. Outrage grew. Inside the room, the mood remained tense. A senior liaison from the Court of Appeals approached Abena and handed her a phone. "The Chief Justice would like to speak with you directly." She took the call, stepping aside for a brief but impactful conversation. When she returned, she handed the phone back and turned to the room. "The Department of Justice has been informed. An official statement will be released within the hour. I am requesting full transcripts, officer reports, and all communication records related to this incident." The airport director swallowed hard. "We'll provide everything, Justice. We deeply regret—" "I'm not interested in apologies," she interrupted. "What I want is accountability." Her words echoed in the room like a verdict. Outside, protesters had already begun to form. Some held signs. Others recorded live videos, speaking directly to their followers about what had happened inside. The story was no longer just about Abena. It had become a symbol of what happens when those sworn to serve the public use judgment instead of law. Meanwhile, Miles sat in a quiet corner of the break room, head in hands. The brash officer who once barked orders now trembled at the thought of what was coming. Bradley, standing alone near a vending machine, kept replaying the moment he looked at Abena's boarding pass and chose to see a lie. Back inside, Abena took her seat again, now uncuffed and supported by her own legal team. She reviewed her notes, highlighted key statements, and marked inconsistencies in the reports already submitted. Though hours had passed since she was pulled from her seat in first class, her resolve had not faded. This was no longer about her seat or her dignity. It was about exposing a system that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. She would not let this be swept under the rug. Not while cameras were watching. Not while justice demanded more than words. For the first time since the incident began, she smiled. Not from satisfaction, but from clarity. They had tried to humiliate her. Instead, they had revealed everything wrong with their system. Now, justice would respond. The courtroom was quiet as the final statements concluded. Sunlight streamed in through tall windows, casting soft shadows across polished wooden floors. Rows of journalists sat motionless, pens ready, their eyes locked on the two former officers seated at the defense table. Dressed in formal suits instead of uniforms, Bradley and Miles looked nothing like the men who had once marched through JFK's terminal with authority. Now they stared straight ahead, pale and nervous, waiting for the judge's decision. Outside, a sea of protesters gathered. Signs waved in the air, demanding justice and reform. The story had gripped the nation for weeks. What began as a racial, profiling incident had grown into a symbol of accountability. It was no longer just about a Supreme Court justice. It was about every traveler, every citizen, every person who had ever been dismissed or doubted because of who they were. Justice. Abena Adeyemi sat with her team, eyes focused but calm. She had said what needed to be said during her testimony. Her voice had been steady, her words sharp, her message clear. The court had heard how she was dragged from her seat, mocked, cuffed, and treated like a criminal, all without cause, all in public view. The recordings had been played. The footage had spoken louder than any accusation or excuse. The federal judge reviewing the case stood, a heavy folder in his hands. His gaze swept the room before delivering the final verdict. The court finds both defendants guilty of unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights under federal law. Their actions displayed not only poor judgment, but dangerous misuse of power rooted in bias and negligence. Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously. Bradley lowered his head. Miles's eyes welled with tears. The sentence followed swiftly. 4 years in federal prison, effective immediately. The judge added that they would be barred from ever holding law enforcement positions again. As officers approached to escort them out, the men offered no resistance. They didn't beg or protest. They had already seen where arrogance had brought them. They passed Abena's bench without looking at her. She remained composed, her presence dignified and unshaken. Meanwhile, Abigail Carter, the passenger who had first triggered the incident with her prejudiced complaint, was not spared either. Facing public outrage and legal pressure, she agreed to a plea deal. Her punishment included a $500,000 fine and public admission of wrongdoing. Her fall from society's favor was swift and merciless. Once a respected philanthropist, she was now infamous for her role in a national disgrace. The Department of Justice announced a federal review of law enforcement behavior at transportation hubs. New policies were introduced, including anti-bias training, stricter accountability measures, and improved passenger protection protocols. Change, though overdue, had begun. In the weeks following the verdict, Justice Abena returned to the Supreme Court. Her colleagues welcomed her back with quiet respect. No one asked for details. They had all watched the news, read the transcripts, seen the impact. Abena resumed her duties with renewed strength. She knew she could not erase what happened, but she could ensure the consequences reached far beyond a courtroom. One morning, as she entered the courthouse steps, a young girl approached her with wide eyes and trembling hands. She looked no older than 12. "Are you the judge from the news?" she asked shyly. Abena smiled gently. "Yes, I am. My mom said you made us proud." Those words stayed with her longer than any legal victory ever had. Across the nation, conversations shifted. Schools discussed implicit bias. Police departments faced community pressure. People talked openly about justice, respect, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Abena's story had become more than headlines. It had become a turning point. She never sought revenge. She didn't need vengeance to make a point. Her truth, her calm resistance, and her decision to stand firm became the greatest act of all. She had been judged unfairly in a place where no judgment should exist. But in the end, it was the system that had to answer to her, and it did.